Good afternoon from Tokyo, where the Asian Development Bank Institute is based. My name is Agnes Sari, and I'm the Deputy Head of Capacity Building and Training at ADBI. Welcome back to the second part of our online training organized with the Asian Development Bank and the International Financial Reporting Standard Foundation on the adoption of the ISSB standards for climate-related information disclosures. Yesterday, we presented the objectives of standardized disclosures, and we took a deep dive into the ISSB standards with a technical overview of IFRS S1, General Requirements for Disclosure of Sustainability-Related Financial Information, and IFRS S2, Climate-Related Disclosures. We discussed the advantage of adopting the standards, and today we will focus on the steps a jurisdiction needs to consider to adopt the ISSB standards. We will have two main sessions. The first one will focus on the inaugural jurisdiction guide, and the second session will focus on the roadmap and development tools. So now I'm very happy to introduce our two speakers, Jonathan Bravo, who is Director of Regulatory Affairs, ISSB IFRS, and Jialing Si, Regulatory Affairs Manager for Asia. We will take a 10-minute break at the beginning of session 2, and Jonathan and Jialing, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Agnes, and let me welcome participants. Good afternoon to all of you. It is again a pleasure for us to join you today in the capacity building workshop and to partner with the Asian Development Bank and the ADBI Institute. You had the chance yesterday to dive into the inaugural ISSB standards, IFRS S1 and IFRS S2, and the purpose of the session today is to run through some of the materials, tools, and resources that we have developed in the IFRS Foundation to support jurisdictions that have an interest in shaping the regulatory frameworks, introducing ISSB standards into regulation, and how they can go along with that exercise of considering, assessing, and introducing the standards into regulation. So we will have the opportunity to discuss and run through the inaugural jurisdictional guide for the adoption or other use of ISSB standards, which is really the foundational document. It was issued in May 2024, and it provides the grounding for the rest of the materials and resources that we are developing for the benefit of regulators in jurisdictions that are leading the adoption process. We'll also have the chance to introduce how the roadmap development tool fits into our regulatory implementation program, which again, it is the series of materials and tools that we're putting together to support jurisdictions in the process. And with further ado, we will get finally into the roadmap development tool, which is a document that we published towards the end of May, which is intended to assist directly jurisdictions which are considering advancing their adoption considerations, but it's also a tool that we have tried to design to enable what we call implementation partners, the MDBs, international bodies, IOSCO, the IMF, World Bank, that are as well do have a duty to support jurisdictions in shaping up their regulation and their financial system. So with that, let's just run into the session. I'll introduce initially my colleague, Jialing Si. She's based in our Beijing office. So Jialing, perhaps some introductory words from you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everyone. Thank you, ADB colleagues, for inviting us and arrange this great capacity building. I'm Jialing Si, and I'm based in Beijing office. I'm the Regulatory Affairs Manager supporting the adoption or other use of ISSB standard, especially in Asia, this region. So it's really great to be here today. So looking forward to our session later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jialing. So we have put together some slides, so let's just get into it. just give us a minute that we will display the slides in the screen. And we have designed the session to be interactive, so we will stop and pause to see whether there are any questions as we progress through our presentation. But of course, we'll just leave some time as well towards the end of the session for any remaining questions that you might come across. So let's progress right away into the agenda, Leanne. And again, this is a bit of an overview of what we will be covering today. I'll start with sharing with you where we stand in terms of the global landscape, where jurisdictions stand in the process of adopting or otherwise using ISSB standards. As I mentioned, we will stop and reflect on the jurisdictional guide and what are the components that ground some of our regulatory materials, the roadmap development tool, and we'll have the chance to perhaps just bring everything together towards the end of the session and stop for questions. So let's just get into the session on progress on jurisdictional updates on the adoption. So let's move into the next slide. So where we stand as of today, you'll see on the screen that there are 36 jurisdictions that are already on the journey. This means that they have either issued consultations, roadmaps, or directly regulations to adopt or otherwise use ISSB standards. As you will see, it encompasses jurisdictions in all regions. It is very evident that there's been significant progress in Asia, Oceania, with quite a number of jurisdictions taking decided steps towards introducing our standards. One thing I would also like to share with you is that, as you will see, they're both most developed markets, really the developed economies, moving ahead and taking steps towards the adoption of our standards. But we see there's also a trend where emerging markets and developing economies are also embracing ISSB standards in order to strengthen their capital markets, provide better information for their investors around sustainability-related risks and opportunities. And there's a decided move towards enhancing how their capital markets can support a cost-effective regime where their companies can provide better information, how investors can make decision-useful choices, how they can reflect, assess, and price sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Let's move into the next slide because we're seeing 36 jurisdictions very representative of the world GDP and market capitalization. But again, there are other jurisdictions that have expressed an interest in progressing their considerations. Many of you, I'm sure, you will be members of IOSCO. Your capital market authorities will be representatives in the IOSCO ecosystem. So in December 2024, a few months ago, IOSCO launched Growth and Emerging Markets Committee Network that's intended to support regulators in advancing their considerations on the adoption or other use of ISSB standards. So 31 jurisdictions, 32 members have initially joined. We understand there are other members that already have volunteered to join the network. And again, as we're doing with the ADBI, the purpose of the network is to provide a level playing field, a cost-effective mechanism for capacity building, help identify with capacity building needs, and of course, something that's very relevant when jurisdictions are trying to progress in their considerations, sharing experience and providing mutual support. And we're truly appreciative of IOSCO's efforts to move ahead. Let's move ahead, Yelling. I just wanted to share with you a survey that we conducted in Q1 this year, where we targeted national standard setters and jurisdictional regulators. The purpose of this survey was really to monitor developments around jurisdictional progress, try to enable the delivery of information for stakeholders. We get many questions from different stakeholders as to where jurisdictions stand, and we thought it was appropriate to try to identify global trends and share with them where we see jurisdictions are heading. But of course, use the information to continue to help us shape how we engage with jurisdictions, how we can bring this data into our regulatory implementation program. And one thing we will cover later on, how this process can inform the development of jurisdictional profiles, which is something we already announced in the jurisdictional guide that we think it's relevant in order to address the demand for information around jurisdictional progress. We can move to the next slide, Eliane. So just some conclusions and takeaways from that survey we conducted at the end of Q1. We got feedback from 55 jurisdictions. 6 of them were from the EU, EEA region. So we grouped them under a single heading. So 49 jurisdictions, all of them responded that they have either introduced or they plan to introduce sustainability-related disclosure requirements into regulation. And 47 out of the 49 jurisdictions, they have noted that they have either already adopted or otherwise use ISSB standards, or they plan to do so. 32 of them have finalized already their regulatory process. Some have already announced they are taking steps going forward. One aspect that I thought was particularly interesting is that 76% of the 47 jurisdictions, they have declared a jurisdictional target of fully adopting ISSB standards, with 9 of them targeting that they will be adopting the climate requirements in ISSB standards, and 10% that will be permitting the use of ISSB standards. And I'll touch on those descriptions of jurisdictional approaches that are included in the jurisdictional guide. But of course, we did ask as well about disclosures that perhaps go beyond those that are required in ISSB standards, and many reference that they do plan to require or permit disclosures that reference as well GRI standards, and certainly within the European space, they reference the ESRSs, which of course do have a broader scope. We can move to the next slide, Eliane, please. So some other conclusions from the survey. There's strong momentum. But again, 30 out of the 49 jurisdictions noted that once they have concluded their roadmaps, once they have executed the transitional reliefs that they're planning for the for phasing in or scaling how entities will be required to report against ISSB standards, they mentioned that the requirements will become effective by the end of 2029. So this gives you some parameters of what are the timelines, the timeframes that jurisdictions are considering. And some of that has to do, of course, with an assessment and evaluation of the market readiness, how their companies, how their investors, how the ecosystem is ready to ensure that there's quality disclosures. And again, 70% will be phasing in requirements, so they will start with an initial application by certain publicly accountable entities, and they will trickle down the entire ecosystem to onboard other entities to report against the standards. We also asked around how jurisdictions are progressing with the assurance requirements, and what we noted is that around 40% of the jurisdictions indicated that they plan to require assurance. We think assurance is very relevant because, of course, investors are interested not just on receiving disclosures, but receiving disclosures that are reliable, trustworthy, that are accurate. And most of those jurisdictions will be starting with requiring limited assurance. You may think that, well, this is perhaps not really encouraging to see that not all the jurisdictions are actually thinking of building an assurance framework to support quality disclosures. But what we're seeing is that jurisdictions are mostly trying to shape up their reporting regime before they consider what's a suitable staged and phase-in plan for the introduction of assurance requirements. So we believe there is a lagging effect where jurisdictions are initially shaping what the reporting regime will be, which are the entities that will be subject to the requirements, and then will finalize to shaping the assurance framework. And I think we also need to be mindful that in the international assurance standard setting ecosystem, both the ISSB and the ISSB, they finalized their standards towards the end of 2024. So they have been recently issued. Some of them are still issuing implementation guidance. So many jurisdictions have actually reflected on those standards before determining what's the assurance regime that will be prevailing. We can move to the next slide, Eliane, please. Just giving you some sort of geographical spread of the responses. We received quite a number of responses in EMEA. There's quite a lot of interest in Asia, in Africa, and in Eastern Europe. on top of course, jurisdictions that are within the EU ecosystem. But there's also quite a lot of interest in the Asia, Oceania, and I'm sure that many of you present in the session today, you will have had discussions in the past around what is the approach that you will be following if you haven't already put together a roadmap or regulations. We're also seeing that there is interest, of course, in the Americas with a number of jurisdictions taking steps. We can move to final slide this session. So what's really coming next for us? I'll be covering later on what we intend to do with the publication of jurisdictional profiles, but we've seen a proliferation of what have been called ISSB adoption trackers. Different accounting firms, different entities are publishing their interpretation of where jurisdictions stand. But we believe it's important to provide transparency to market participants, both to investors so that they can understand when they receive disclosures from an entity in a particular jurisdiction, what's really the framework that prevails, but as well for companies that will probably have operations across different jurisdictions and they may need to comply with different reporting regimes. So it's important as well for them. But finally, also for regulators, they're all looking to the neighbors, how they are progressing, how the regulations may actually impact the regulated entities in my jurisdiction. So they do have an interest, of course, in understanding what's the global barometer around adoption. So our intention is to publish an initial set of profiles by the end of H2, where we will be reporting to specific circumstances. Where do jurisdictions stand as of 2025, and what's the stated jurisdictional target? How they see their regulation coming once the transition release, once they have executed all the different milestones in their roadmaps. But of course, this is also going to inform very much the tools and the resources that we outlined in the regulatory implementation program to support jurisdictions. We launched the roadmap development tool in March, and we're working closely with implementation partners. We held a first implementation partner workshop at the end of March, where we had the opportunity to engage with many of the international bodies that are engaging on the ground with different jurisdictions. So with that, I don't know whether any questions in the chat around this session. If not, we'll just move into the next topic, which is again just trying to ground where we stand with respect to the foundational document, the inaugural jurisdictional guide.
Yeah,
let's move into
Jonathan.
Yes.
There are some questions. Yeah, there is a question on the role of insurance. It's quite a broad question, but the question is, what is the role of insurance in the green finance, and what should be covered under the insurance framework and also for ISSB?
Thank you very much, Agnes, for the question. I wasn't absolutely sure whether they were referring to assurance or insurance. I'll anyway cover both. Of course, insurance companies are fundamental in grounding a sound, stable financial system. And we have included particular provisions in ISSB standards, and probably you had the chance yesterday to identify what's really the architecture in the standards and how industry-specific disclosures can support quality information, both for regulators, for the prudential insurance authorities, but also for market participants. So we have spent some time identifying what may be suitable for the insurance business, because it is absolutely fundamental that they receive as users of sustainability-related information from the real economy, so that they can actually identify where risks are building. We also understand that insurance companies are fundamental in the financial ecosystem. So we will cover that later on. In the jurisdictional guide, we noted that insurance companies, together with banks, asset managers, they are entities that do have public accountability because of the way they support their financial system. So it is very relevant to understand what are the particular provisions that are included in ISSB standards that relate to the insurance sector. We do have, particularly when it comes to climate, particular provisions that affect insurance companies when it comes to finance emissions because of their insurance activity they conduct. So they are as well very much fundamental in the way we have approached our disclosures and the way we are engaging with jurisdictions to ensure that they put together a comprehensive regulatory regime where both banks and insurance companies have the ability to receive sound information around both sustainability-related risks and opportunities, because that's going to give them the grounding to be able to identify whether there is any sector that is particularly sensitive or vulnerable to climate or other sustainability risks, or whether there are opportunities that are emerging in, again, certain buckets within the economy that they should actually be supporting.
And Jonathan, there is another question. What is the difference between full assurance and limited assurance?
Right. It's probably not for us to determine. That's probably more a question for our peers, both from the ISSB and the ISSB. But there are probably two different scopes within assurance. One is limited assurance, which again limits the type of scope. And I think it's important both for regulators, but also for market participants and investors to be able to identify what are the expectations of the type of assurance-related work that has been conducted to ensure the trustworthiness of information. There is an expanded approach which entails reasonable assurance, which enhances the scope of the assurance exercise. It does provide assurance more on a reasonable basis, so it just has an expanded scope, which it's more comprehensive than perhaps the more limited one. Again, it's not for the IFRS Foundation or for the ISSB to determine what is the regime that jurisdictions should follow. Both the audit-related standard setters have issued standards covering the assurance-related aspects, but also the ethics and independent requirements. And we believe it is important, and we're covering this in the roadmap development tool, that jurisdictions from the outset consider what is a reasonable phased-in approach for the introduction of assurance.
Thank you very much. One last question. If a country decides to adopt ISSB standards, who can help the country to put together a roadmap? What will be the ideal process?
Thank you for that question. And again, jurisdictions are really sovereign to decide what is the journey they want to follow. Some will have developed significant expertise because they do have pre-existing regulations that may already introduce some of the building blocks that compose that are central to ISSB standards. Some may have already introduced a complier explained regime for TCFD, the TCFD recommendations. Some may have already progressed with introducing requirements around SASB standards. Some may have an accounting profession that is more up to speed with respect to some of those requirements, and assurance has been taking place in the jurisdiction. We do understand, however, that many jurisdictions are looking for technical assistance, which is why we're trying to equip what we call implementation partners, bodies like IOSCO, bodies like the World Bank, the IMF, the ADB, the regional MDBs, to ensure they do understand our materials. And in the event they do have the ability to provide technical assistance, they can actually rely on our materials to ensure that jurisdictions have a suitable framework for them to progress. So our materials have been designed to support jurisdictions directly, but as well implementation partners. We're also cognizant that some regulators, some jurisdictions are relying on the accountancy networks to support their steps they're taking in the process. So we're also engaging with them to ensure that at the global level, there's a proper understanding of our resources, and that can actually be spread around the different firms at the local level, so that those being involved can provide what we think it's good advice for jurisdictions. So, but the decision has to be made by, and we'll cover that as part of the regulatory process in the roadmap development tool. So let me perhaps stop here, Agnes, and we'll cover that more specifically, because we believe there is, again, an exercise where the different authorities need to come together to decide what's the comprehensive approach that jurisdictions should build to ensure that there is a cohesive, reasonable regulatory framework, bringing together all the different pieces.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And let's continue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the questions. So I've been talking already about the inaugural jurisdictional guide. So let's get into that. We can move to the next slide just to give you a sense of where we are coming from, because of course, the inaugural jurisdictional guide followed an extensive engagement with different regulators, different bodies. So we published in July 2023, at the same time as the IOSCO endorsement of ISSB standards. We published, let's say, an initial document that was an overview, trying to provide some pointers for jurisdictions as to how they could move along in the adoption journey. Many of the principles and concepts and notions that you will see in the jurisdictional guide stem already from that initial document that was published shortly after the release of our first standards. But again, in February 2024, we published a preview of the inaugural guide. And the reason for doing that was because we understood that many jurisdictions were already in the process of introducing regulation, and we wanted to ensure they had the chance to reflect on some of the considerations that we believe are fundamental in helping design what's a suitable framework that would be conducive to providing comparable information at global level for capital markets, and that reflects on some of the features that we believe should take part in a jurisdictional regulatory regime. We can move to the next slide. So the inaugural jurisdictional guide was published almost a year from now, May 2024. And again, as I noted before, the objective is to promote globally consistent and comparable disclosures for capital markets. And we wanted to ensure that regulators had some parameters as they were progressing in the design of their roadmaps. And again, we were really interested in ensuring that we learn from the lessons of how we progress towards the introduction of a global language for financial reporting in order to try to mitigate regulatory fragmentation, in order to ensure there was comparability, in order to ensure we had a regime that fostered transparency, but at the same time was cost effective. And as I mentioned before, we think it's fundamental to provide transparency as to where jurisdictions stand. As you can imagine, investors will not have the chance to fully dive deeply into the regulatory regimes in 100 jurisdictions, and they do have global portfolios. So having a central one-stop shop where they can find information about where jurisdictions stand in the process, we think that is useful. But also companies that do operate across borders and that will need to consider, on the one hand, what are the requirements for their subsidiaries, how they can integrate that into the consolidated reports, and whether they may need to build their systems in order to be able to provide information across different jurisdictions. So we think it's important to advance in providing transparency, and we're getting through the process where we will be releasing information by the end of Q2 this year. We can move to the next slide, Eliane. And again, I've already covered why transparency can support the ecosystem, but I think it's important as well to note that for us as standard setters, it's also important to understand how jurisdictions are advancing in their adoption processes, because that helps us identify capacity building needs and where we may need to partner with others in the ecosystem to, as the ADB, supporting you all in making good steps in the right direction. We can just move ahead, perhaps just diving into some of the key pillars in the jurisdictional guide that actually frame much of the work that you will see later today as part of the roadmap development tool. So we had introduced the concepts of features of jurisdictional approaches, and there were 11 that we thought were fundamental, and we invited jurisdictions to think about the processes for all of those. I won't spend much time here because we will be covering this in depth But just to let you know that most of the materials we're developing actually go back to the jurisdictional guide. So that's a very reasonable document as a starting point for all of you to get abreast of how the IFRS Foundation, how the ISSB can support jurisdictions design regulation in a way that their regime does provide transparency and does have ISSB standards as the global baseline central to its regulatory regime. We can move to the next slide, Yeleng. One of the things that we noted is that we acknowledged that jurisdictions would be progressing over time. So we came up with 7 descriptions of jurisdictional approaches, which again, were focusing not just on the form that the jurisdiction is given to its roadmap, but really on the outcomes. What is the information that users of general purpose financial reports, including on sustainability related risks and opportunities, will receive? And we came up with 7 different pathways towards the adoption or other use of ISSB standards. And again, you've heard me already a few times reflect on that term, adoption or other use. And we wanted to ensure that was capturing one of the references in the IOSCO statement, talking about how jurisdictions can actually adopt, apply, or use ISSB standards in shaping their framework. So we wanted to be comprehensive and inclusive. There are jurisdictions that will be directly adopting our standards by reference, so basically introducing regulation that directly refer to IFRS 1 and IFRS 2. But we also see that jurisdictions are developing their domestic standards, building and aligning with ISSB standards. So we wanted to ensure that the different approaches were capturing all of those circumstances. So out of the 7 approaches, one is will be reflecting jurisdictions that have committed to the adoption or other use of ISSB standards, and they have signaled that to the marketplace. So they have issued a public statement by an authoritative body, noting that they will be adopting, they're signaling to the market participants that their direction of travel is that ISSB standards will be embedded into regulation, but they have made clear that the adoption timeframe is in the future. So we noted that those jurisdictions that have indicated that they will be adopting by 2029, they will be described as committing to adoption or other use of ISSB standards, and the profiles will reflect this circumstance. There are other jurisdictions that will be permitting the use of ISSB standards. Some will be doing so as a way to build capacity in their markets before moving from a voluntary regime into a mandatory regime. And again, we'll cover that later on, but jurisdictions such as Brazil and Nigeria, they have initially permitted the use of ISSB standards since 2024, and they have signaled that they will be mandating, they will be requiring entities to use ISSB standards in their sustainability reports from a certain given time in the future. There will be also jurisdictions that will be partially incorporating ISSB standards. Some may decide to introduce modifications. Some will do so as a transitional manner to reduce the requirements in ISSB standards, and they will be incorporating them later on. So you can probably anticipate some jurisdictions may be initially partially incorporating ISSB standards, but they have signaled that they have a jurisdictional target of fully adopting ISSB standards. So they will be bringing on the remaining requirements in ISSB standards later in the process, but they will start with an initial set of the requirements in the ISSB standards. There are other jurisdictions that will just be extending some of the transition reliefs that are included in IFRS 1 and IFRS 2, and I'm sure you had the chance yesterday to reflect on those. So we have noted 2 different possibilities. One is adopting ISSB standards with limited transition, so those jurisdictions that may have extended transition relief for some of the requirements that are in ISSB standards for a period of 1 to 3 years. Some will be adopting with extended transition, meaning that they will be extending some of the transition reliefs, again, already included in IFRS 1 and IFRS 2 for a period of 3 to 5 years. We also understand that there are some jurisdictions that will be starting with a climate first approach. So they will be adopting the climate requirements in ISSB standards, which means adopting IFRS S2 in full, so without extensions of transition reliefs, and all the essential provisions in IFRS S1 to ensure that IFRS S2 operates in the way it was intended to operate. So ensuring that investors will receive information in accordance with the climate requirements in ISSB standards. And again, the final description, fully adopting ISSB standards, which we believe is the most effective approach in order to deliver globally comparable information for capital markets. And our aspiration is that many jurisdictions will be fully adopting ISSB standards. And again, just want to note that this reflects not just jurisdictions that are making full use of ISSB standards, so introducing directly ISSB standards into regulation, but this approach also captures jurisdictions that will be developing their own frameworks, and these frameworks will be designed to deliver what we've called functionally aligned outcomes with those resulting from the application of IFRS S1 and IFRS S2. In some circumstances, and this is the case in some Asian jurisdictions, some jurisdictions are developing their own local brand of ISSB standards, but they basically replicate the content. Some other jurisdictions may be taking a slightly different approach in terms of the language used, but the outcomes are considered to be functionally aligned. And I will be touching on that later on, just to give you a sense of some of those parameters that we will be using in reviewing and determining whether a framework is designed to deliver that degree of alignment. We can move to the next session. Maybe let's stop here and see whether any questions popping up in the chat.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, I think you mentioned it, but there was a question about, based on the experience of some advanced jurisdictions, what is the average time period from inception to full adoption?
I think there's no direct answer to that. There's not one size fits all. And again, jurisdictions will need to reflect on where they stand in the journey. What is really the capacity of the companies, whether the companies do have experience in reporting sustainability or whether this is something entirely new. And again, it will be no surprise for some of you that I think even some jurisdictions that charted ahead with a very comprehensive approach, they're considering what is a pragmatic approach to ensure that the ecosystem can digest and can absorb those requirements in a way that is still conducive to an effective capital market system that ensures that there is information available, but at the same time that companies that will be subject to regulation can actually navigate the process. So again, I mentioned in the survey that we understand that many jurisdictional frameworks will be completed by 2029. Some are actually bringing that forward. That's the case, and we will be covering that later on. But many jurisdictions have already introduced requirements in 2025, and they are progressing to be fully adopting ISSB standards by 2027. So that is why I would encourage most of the participants, once the profiles are out, to take a look and get a good understanding of what are the timeframes that jurisdictions are using. I should also be saying that jurisdictions are scaling requirements in depending on the size, capabilities of their regulated entities. So for instance, for listed entities, most markets do have different market tiers, market segments, and they're starting to introduce requirements for the top end of the market, what we call prime or premium markets. So the largest entities that generally are the ones that have greater capacity. And they're perhaps deferring the introduction or onboarding of other companies to a later stage. We did note in the jurisdictional guide that in this initial period, because we do understand we're all getting to learn a new language, companies, jurisdictions, the assurance providers, the advisors, the entire ecosystem, that we thought it was reasonable to start with those entities that have the capability. And we will be, again, reflecting on that as we move into the reporting entities section of the roadmap development, which provides, I think, some pointers. Short answer, there's no one size fits all. Yes. I think it's important to share information. There are many jurisdictions that actually share similar circumstances in terms of market readiness, in terms of market cap, in terms of market size. And we think it's fundamental to have a proper understanding of what the neighbors. This is why bodies like IOSCO, the ADB, the ADBI help bringing all together so that we also create information sharing forums so that jurisdictions can actually share their experiences, what went well, what has proven to be a bit more challenging.
Thank you very much. On this topic, there is also a question on the pros and cons of implementing a phased approach whereby the ISSB adoption, ISSB standard adoption will be decided only for public entities, and then later for private listed entities, for example, versus having an approach where the ISSB standard will be adopted in both cases. Could you share your views on this?
No, sure. Happy to do that. And again, just reflecting on the jurisdictional guide, we think this is a, there are inherent challenges to adopting requirements for all at the same time. Again, I think we need to be cognizant that companies will need to navigate a process. They will need to get ready their systems. They will be consuming a lot of advice, and sometimes there are limited professional resources that are available in the jurisdiction to support entities. And we also need to be cognizant that their value chain considerations, so by the fact that the largest entities, those that have wider, broader value chains, are the first ones starting in the process, that will mean that others that may not have that degree of public accountability will also start in the process by gathering information in order to be supplied to those entities that will be fully captured by regulations. I think we also need to be mindful that at least from an IFRS Foundation perspective, the standards we put together are designed to support capital markets. And again, we need to reflect that there are entities that do have public accountability. Those investors, creditors, lenders, the way they access information is through general purpose financial reports that are released on a public manner. Private entities that have other ownership structures do have other relationships across with their owners, with their investors, with their lenders. And again, we understand that information is particularly relevant, but we think there is a need also to be pragmatic in the way jurisdictions approach this journey. And again, this builds very much from the lessons learned from the introduction of IFRS accounting standards, which again, jurisdictions, some at least decided to progress really fast, and they faced some of the challenges. Some others decided to phase in and scale some of the requirements, and that allowed the market to mature and grow at a pace that was conducive to high quality disclosures. What we don't want to, what we want to make clear is that from the IFRS Foundation, we are not rushing jurisdictions to get on board, because we think it's of no purpose having the perfect regulatory framework if companies cannot actually report high quality disclosures that are useful. We think it's more reasonable to try to handhold and support the system evolve at pace so that we're building capacity and we ensure that there is confidence that the disclosures that are being provided are truly decision useful and that they foster investment decisions based on that. Investors will need that information, and companies that are willing to finance their transition will ensure they need to be able to raise capital from investors. So quality is at the center of what we're doing. It's not a race towards adoption, it's a race towards quality of the adoption and consistency in the process.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think Professor Sayuri Shiraya has a question for you.
I just want to ask one question. Maybe a lot of financial regulators have similar question. As we discussed yesterday, many emerging economies, they already encouraged their companies to disclose GRI standard-based disclosure. Okay, but you have now a very complete, consistent S1 and S2, and those disclosure are supposed to be placed in sort of general purpose corporate annual reports. So are you kind of suggesting that priority should be sort of S1, S2 in a general purpose annual report, and kind of additionally, sort of as a voluntary disclosure, the company still continue to disclose GRI standard based information in kind of sustainability report in a separate place. Can you clarify this?
Right. Thank you very much, Professor, for the question. And again, all of this is really, really pertinent. This is why we have devoted a particular section in our roadmap development to address that. So we will be covering that as part of how the IFRS standards anticipate additional disclosure requirements beyond those that are included in ISSB standards. I think what I can say right now is that our standards are designed to allow a building blocks approach where jurisdictions can actually build a regime where they also include requirements for information that may address the needs of a different set of stakeholders beyond investors, or in order to meet certain jurisdictional policy objectives. Our standards are really designed to provide information that's useful for primary users of general purpose financial reports. What we're noting in our standards is that additional disclosures that may be required, they need to be presented, they need to be structured in a way that information that is central for investment decision making. It's clearly identifiable and is not obscured. So we are not prescribing through our regime how jurisdictions, what jurisdictions should be requiring. We note that the disclosures aligned with ISSB standards should be part of general purpose financial reports, and they should be read in conjunction with financial statements because they are intended to support investors in their decision and their investment decisions. So again, it is the connectivity with financial information, with other sustainability risks and opportunities that's central for investors' decision making. Jurisdictions that have already started with introducing a regime that is based on GRI standards, they can continue to do so. They just need to ensure that the information that is based on GRI standards is presented in a way that it doesn't obscure information required by ISSB standards. And again, just let me know that, as you probably found out yesterday, in IFRS 1, for those disclosure topics that may not already be covered by an IFRS sustainability disclosure standard, there is a reference for companies to be able to rely on other frameworks, including GRI standards, in order to determine information that may be material for investors. So they can actually draw from GRI standards. And we believe that jurisdictions that have been have experience with GRI standards, they're well placed in order to progress their considerations. I should also note that there are certain areas, for instance, in GHG emissions, where we have conducted some research together with GRI that I think do determine what is the degree of alignment. So our standards have a very clear purpose, which is to support capital markets in their decision making. And we believe that our standards are designed in order to allow additional disclosures being built on top to the extent that disclosures for investors are not obscure. So that's a central requirement, and we'll be touching on that later on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question. So let's move on. I think in the interest of time, I'm sure some of the questions we'll have the chance to cover that as we progress, I think, with the presentation. So just wanted to frame our regulatory implementation program that actually gives shape to some of the things that we've been discussing. We can move to the next slide. Eliane, please. Again, we've been covering the jurisdictional guide, which again provides information and resources to jurisdictions. We've been talking about the benefits of transparency for the ecosystem, but as well for regulators trying to identify whether peers are in the process. But we think it's important as well to try to provide a level of granularity that supports jurisdictions, perhaps having resources to discuss some of the aspects that have been coming up in some of the questions. And again, we think it's important to conduct work on what is really the policy rationale for jurisdictions to adopt or otherwise use ISSB standards, particularly in emerging markets. And we're doing some work, and we will we'll expect to be able to publish something later on in the year in order to enable jurisdictions to understand what is really the policy rationale. We've been drawing very much from those jurisdictions that have already started in the process. What is the rationale that they have reflected in order to decide to adopt ISSB standards? But importantly as well, we because we do understand there are many questions coming up from jurisdictions as to how they can get started. So we have developed that roadmap development tool again in order to help them translate the jurisdictional guide into practical application. And again, I mentioned before the description of jurisdictional approaches. So we have also come up with roadmap templates that can be used as a reference point for jurisdictions to determine whether their decision and outcomes will be conducive to a particular jurisdictional approach, how it may meet its quality objectives, and how it will be described by the IFRS Foundation. We're also cognizant that, again, the demand for capacity building is unlimited. So that's also the case for regulators and supervisors and enforcers and different authorities. So we have the willingness, and we noted that in our regulatory implementation program, that we will be conducting some work in order to ensure that there is content that is suitable, that is relevant for a regulatory related audience, including online resources. And again, the roadmap development tool is already available on our website. But again, really important, Sam mentioned, how can jurisdictions progress? What's the level of support that's available? So again, we are working together with our partners to ensure capacity building is delivered in a way that they do have the resources to be able to do their job. We're designing tools to support technical assistance. The roadmap development tool can be a central resource when jurisdictions seek support from international bodies, from NDBs in progressing with their roadmaps. And again, as I mentioned before, it's really relevant that we ensure there are platforms, there are forums for regulators to be able to share their experiences. Let's move ahead, Eliane. And again, just trying to frame how our resources can support jurisdictions in the process. As standard setters, we are cognizant that we're very central to enable the different mechanisms to support jurisdictions. But again, because of our role as standard setters, because of our limited capacity, because others do have the mandates and the responsibility to support jurisdictions in the process, we've been working in order to ensure that our resources were suitable to be used by others. So together with the jurisdictional guide, the policy rational materials, the roadmap development tool, and the templates and the educational materials, we are trying to train and equip implementation partners and those advisors. At the end of the day, as many of you will know, for instance, the ADB may have the willingness, resources, and ability to support a certain jurisdiction in trying to advance in one of their regulatory areas, but generally they also need to rely on experts, advisors, assessors. So those experts, we also need to ensure they're well trained in order to use our materials. So we are also putting together a program to support implementation advisors. And again, the delivery can happen through different mechanisms. Some regulators, some jurisdictions may be able to use our materials directly. Some others will be looking for partnering, like the IOSCO GEMC network, the IFC, SBFN, the ADB. But again, we think it's important for global bodies, the MDBs, to ensure how they can build their toolkits that support jurisdiction on the basis of our materials. We can move to the next slide, Eliane. Let's skip this one, please. Let's move to we can skip that one and perhaps just move to slide 23. Oh, sorry. Next one, please. Oh, sorry. Have a different set. So with that, let me perhaps just move into the introduction of the roadmap development tool, which is really what's really central to our training session today. So let's move to the next one. And again, this chart is really representative of what I think it's a typical standardized illustrative journey of how a jurisdiction progresses up the ladder. The first one, of course, entails becoming familiar with ISSB standards, and sessions like the one we conducted yesterday, with the one we're conducting today, does provide, I think, authorities and regulators with that basic foundational knowledge and understanding of the value proposition of our standards. After that, jurisdictions will really be assessing the case for adoption. And again, they'll probably heard from their market participants, from their investors, from their companies, their interest in progressing with the adoption and their own considerations. It will be important, again, for jurisdictions to assess what's the market readiness, the maturity of their ecosystem, and probably the policy rational materials that we're developing will be central to supporting jurisdictions assessing the case. The focus of the roadmap development tool is really to support those jurisdictions that are developing a plan, a roadmap, regulations. And again, it is important to ground all of that on the key features that were included in the jurisdictional guide. And that just starts really the journey for different jurisdictions. The roadmap just expresses a jurisdictional ambition, a time frame, how entities will be onboarded, but then a jurisdiction that has introduced requirements, that has introduced a roadmap, will really need to ensure they do provide the capacity building, they do provide clarity on how the regulations will materialize some of the ambitions that have been expressed in the roadmap, and they will need to ensure they actually measure what are the different milestones that they need to put in place. And again, the focus is ensuring there's quality disclosures, ensuring there is a reasonable pragmatic approach towards the introduction of the standards. We can move to the next slide. And again, you can access the roadmap development tool through that QR code. The roadmap development tool is available already on our website. It includes some videos, some introduction materials that basically frame what is the purpose and how it can support you in your own considerations. We can move to the next slide, Yaling. Again, let me just start by noting that it is not prescriptive or mandatory to have a roadmap. Many jurisdictions have already started with drawing regulations, maybe because they were ahead of the process. We do understand, however, that developing and communicating a roadmap can be a valuable step. And given many jurisdictions will be transitioning over time, we think it's important to provide visibility as to what are the timeframes, what are the different milestones. And it also helps identify which are the leading adopting authorities in the jurisdiction. It can help assign responsibilities. Sometimes the prudential authorities need to ensure they're well coordinated with the securities regulator, the capital market authorities, with the standard setters, with the audit oversight bodies, with the financial reporting councils. So all of those players need to be well coordinated, and bringing them together, standing behind a roadmap, helps in that process. Having a roadmap also helps measure progress against adoption. If milestones have been identified, jurisdictions and regulators will be able to measure whether the goals and objectives that were identified in the process have actually been met. And it's important as well to ensure accountability. So it also helps with that process. And as I mentioned before, identifying dependencies, identifying the resources and expertise that is available and that will be necessary to support the process is also helpful. We can move to the next slide. So again, the roadmap development tool tries to support regulators and jurisdictions as they work through the policy considerations and plan and design their project plan we have called a roadmap. It helps assess the implications of the decisions of approaches, how the jurisdictional approach will achieve the policy objectives that had been set from the outset, how the jurisdictional approach will be understood by capital market participants and other stakeholders, and also very relevant, how the jurisdictional approach will be described by the IFRS Foundation in a jurisdictional profile when we publish those. So the profiles will include information about the jurisdictional approaches that are included in the jurisdictional guide. So the roadmap development tool helps have a reference point for jurisdictions as to how their approach, the decisions, their outcomes will be described. We can move to the next slide. So again, the roadmap development tool has two core components. One is the tool itself. It has a tabular form, 4 decision areas, what we've called the 4 Rs, and we'll be touching on those: regulatory process, reporting entities, requirements, readiness. And for each decision area, for each of those 4 Rs, there's an overarching guidance. There are key matters for consideration that are related to the features in the jurisdictional guide. There's a checklist of key decisions to be made and a spectrum of possible outcomes that are linked to the templates. So again, the templates are designed to complement the tool. Assessing jurisdictions understand the implications of the alternative options, the alternative decisions, the alternative outcomes, and the templates will describe both how a jurisdiction may be profiled as the current status, as if we were to draw a profile in 2055, what would be the resulting jurisdictional approach, as well as the jurisdictional target. Once the different milestones have been completed, where the jurisdiction will land. So let's perhaps move to the next one. So again, I mentioned before the 4 Rs, and you will recall one slide I mentioned I wouldn't be touching that sort of honeycomb with all the features of the jurisdictional approaches. So what we have done in the roadmap development tool is basically group those features under the 4 decision areas. The how, the regulatory process. So that covers one of the features that's in the jurisdictional guide. The who, the reporting entities, how we can onboard the different entities, the different regulated companies that are in take part in a jurisdiction. What is a reasonable process to onboard them? What will be the requirements? The what? What's the degree of alignment? Will we be extending transition release? Will we need to make jurisdictional modifications on whether this will be transitional? And then the readiness. What is a reasonable effective date in light of the maturity and readiness of my market participants, and how I can go along with extending transition release? So that's very much the structure of the roadmap. I covered this one, so we can probably skip. But again, those 7 approaches will have their corresponding templates. And so this is, for instance, an illustrative example of a template. So you will see that on the left-hand side of that chart, there are the features that are included, organized by the 4 decision areas with a range of different outcomes. And again, you'll see that in green, that is the description of a jurisdiction that's fully adopting ISSB standards. We're marking in gray or in orange those combinations or outcomes that may not lead towards the approach being described as fully adopting. It may have other suitable descriptions. And again, this is not a ranking. This is not a scorecard. It's just providing a reference point for which are the features that may result in different outcomes and will be therefore described differently by the IFRS Foundation in the profiles. So we can move on. I think we can skip that. Again, we were covering the illustrative stages of a jurisdictional journey, and the roadmap development tool is intended to support jurisdictions that are actually developing a roadmap. So again, there are other considerations that are included in the roadmap development tool that are not central to the description of a jurisdictional approach, but we believe are relevant for regulators, for jurisdictions to consider. We've been talking already about assurance, and we invite jurisdictions to reflect on that. So there's a particular section where jurisdictions can actually look into what's the assurance framework, the assurance level, the assurance standards, how they will supervise assurance providers, and what is the scope of entities that will be required to provide assurance, whether assurance will be provided for the entirety of the sustainability report, or whether it will be just for a subset. So all of those are important considerations, and there is content in a roadmap development tool that provides some pointers for jurisdiction. We also believe that, of course, and this is very central for many of the participants on the call today, that supervision and enforcement is important. As we mentioned before, we are very much supportive, high quality comprehensive, consistent, comparable disclosures for capital markets. And assurance is a stepping stone towards ensuring the trustworthiness of information. But again, for in a mandatory regime, the role of the supervisors and enforcers is important in order to drive quality, to drive discipline, to ensure that investors do have protection mechanisms as well. So we're trying to invite jurisdictions to reflect on what's a proportionate supervisory approach, whether they may start with ensuring there's reasonable surveillance, whether they have the focus on particular areas to ensure there's quality reporting, but perhaps not getting right away into enforcement, sanctioning regimes. What's the timing for measures around non-compliance? And as well, trying to reflect as to how regulators can actually upskill their officers that will be conducting supervision and enforcement. So that is another consideration that's included in the roadmap development tool that perhaps presents ISSB standards. We can move to the next slide, Yelling, please. So again, we think it's important for jurisdictions to consider as part of their roadmap, what are the market readiness skills and expertise that are available, and what are the processes that they need to put in place to ensure there is capacity building. And again, we need to be mindful that in the current context, digital reporting is also fundamental. Users consume information digitally, and while we're not imposing or we're not prescribing the use of the ISSB taxonomy alongside ISSB standards, we think it's in order to describe jurisdictional approaches, we think it is an important element that jurisdictions should consider. I think we also need to be mindful that, particularly because there may be interoperability considerations, it's important that information is tagged and that investors that operate large portfolios have the availability to draw from structured data. So again, all of those are additional considerations to the features that we identified in the jurisdictional guide. So let me perhaps stop here before we dive into the first R, the first decision area on the regulatory process.
Jonathan, I think we can continue and go ahead.
Excellent. So let's move into that one. So establishing the regulatory process. So let's get into that. So there is only one feature in the jurisdictional guide touching on the process, but we think this one is particularly relevant because it will actually determine the initial steps that different authorities involved in designing a roadmap will need to think about. So again, only one feature in the jurisdictional guide, but it's a very clear one. Adopting or otherwise using ISSB standards will necessarily require the introduction by law or regulation of a requirement to apply ISSB standards or introduce sustainability-related disclosure. So that will determine very much how we take on, I think, the approach. If we can move to the next slide, Yelling, please. So there's elements of guidance included in the roadmap development tool. Again, how to support jurisdictions and regulators transitioning from voluntary reporting frameworks, the option for companies to pick and choose from different regimes, to a mandatory regime that's founded on the ISSB standard on the global baseline. And we do understand that introducing regulation is resource intense, not just for the regulators and the authorities that need to assess the cost benefits of the proposal, but also the engagement with the different market participants. And particularly for emerging markets and developing economies, we believe it is important as well to try to leverage on process efficiencies. And again, reflecting on the IOSCO's independent and thorough review of ISSB standards and the endorsement that determined that ISSB standards were fit for purpose for use on capital markets, and their call for actions to its members, over 130 jurisdictions, to determine how they could adopt, apply, or otherwise use ISSB standards, we believe that this process is fundamental in ensuring that jurisdictions can take comfort from that policy review that was being conducted. Again, a jurisdiction that needs to put in place a process will need to determine whether they will draw their own standards, whether they will draw listing rules, detailed listing rules on the basis of the standards, and we believe it's important to the extent possible to try to define, I think, efficiencies. Again, as we mentioned before, there are different approaches. One is whether the legal or regulatory action will require or explicitly permit the ISSB standards. We have received questions from different jurisdictions noting, well, we do have a number of early adopters on a voluntary basis. There is no regulation making reference to the permission to use ISSB standards, but different entities are doing so. We believe that permitting ISSB standards as described in the jurisdictional guide will require a specific legal or regulatory provision to permit the standards and to ensure that permitting the use of ISSB standards can enable companies to be deemed to be compliant with the regime, I think, in place. It's important as well to think about the pace and the approach that is being used and the various mechanisms that jurisdictions have available in order to introduce requirements, drawing standards, having a bulletin by the securities regulator, listing rules, Companies Act. There are different legal mechanisms that jurisdictions can consider. So there are provisions in the roadmap development rule touching on that. If we can move to the next slide, Eliane. Again, I think it's important to not just think about what is the adoption process on an initial basis. As standard setting, it's a dynamic process. Standards are not static. ISSB standards are designed with the support and input from the market in order to support capital markets. So they need to be reactive and responsive to their realities. So there are post-implementation reviews. Some of you will be aware that we have already advanced that we will be introducing some changes to IFRS 2. There will be new standards potentially coming up in the future. So a jurisdiction determining adoption will need to reflect not just what is the stance for IFRS 1 and IFRS 2, but how they will need to build the mechanisms to ensure they are reactive to any potential changes in the standards. They will need to assign clear roles and responsibilities, and an important element as well. They will need to determine whether they will be translating ISSB standards to ensure that the market participants can read and understand and reflect and react to the standards, but also what are the licensing policies that the IFRS Foundation has in place for jurisdictions to make use of ISSB standards. And the roadmap development tool includes particular references there as to what are suitable licensing approaches. So again, the aim is to ensure there's a long-term, cohesive, comprehensive regulatory regime cutting across the different components. If we can move to the next slide, Eliane. Again, so I noted before what are the matters for consideration. There are different outcomes that are possible for a jurisdiction, whether there is no regulatory or legal action taken, whether ISSB standards will be permitted, or whether ISSB standards will be required. Again, as I mentioned before, when I covered the template, the green tab is reflective of what will be the approach describing jurisdictions that will be fully adopting ISSB standards. The others in orange doesn't mean they are, it's not a support card. Some of them will be actually permitting ISSB standards before moving into required. But again, for jurisdiction to be described as adopting or otherwise using ISSB standards, they will have had to introduce a requirement into regulation. So again, jurisdictions will need to consider whether there are any local laws, whether adjustments, adaptations of those local laws are possible, whether they will need to come up with new laws. What are the implications of any extraterritorial requirements for domestic entities, whether some of their regulated entities are already subject to third country requirements? what were really the interactions between the different authorities and the different regulatory pieces, whether there are any conflicts, overlaps between regulation, introducing ISSB standards, and other regulatory pieces. And of course, some of you, for instance, following the developments in the EU, you will have seen that there is again an invitation to ensure that the different regulatory pieces are cohesive and are integral to the process. So we invite jurisdictions to think about those considerations from the get-go. We can move to the next slide, trying to reflect on some of the regulatory or legal instruments. We just wanted to illustrate some of the few options and just try to provide some examples as well as to how some jurisdictions have been moving ahead. There's, of course, government legislation with some of the policymakers, the different ministries are involved. And we've seen this in the case, for instance, of Australia, where the Treasury has been involved, setting the path, where later on the standard setter and the securities regulator have completed the pieces. This is also the case in Turkey, where the Public Oversight Accounting and Auditing Standards Authority, belonging to the Ministry of Finance, has taken the lead in designing Turkish standards that reproduce ISSB standards and determining what is the regulation. We've seen in other cases where it is the capital market authorities, the securities regulator, charting ahead. And in the case of Brazil, it was the CBM, the securities regulator, who determined the roadmap together with the Ministry of Finance. In other cases, it's the central bank, it's the prudential authority moving ahead, because their financial institutions are truly significant. And this is the case, for instance, in Bangladesh, where the central bank has actually determined the first step in the adoption process, where later on the Securities and Exchanges Commission is considering as well how to expand from the requirements already in place for banks to other entities in the capital markets. Stock exchanges also play a key role, and we have the case, for instance, in Singapore with SGX, or in Hong Kong with Hong Kong Stock Exchange, drawing listing rules, starting to introduce ISSB standards by amending some of their listing requirements. And again, some of these jurisdictions have also noted that some of the requirements will extend beyond listed entities, and there will be other authorities involved. For instance, in the case of Singapore, it will be ACRA as well being involved. In other cases, and this is a pattern that's particularly, I think, meaningful in Africa, we see the public accountants being involved in setting and establishing the roadmaps and the regulatory regime. They do have chartered responsibilities to determine the reporting frameworks that prevail in the jurisdiction. So again, just some references for all of you to determine what's a suitable approach, depending on what is the regulatory regime prevailing in your jurisdiction. And we can move to the next slide. As I mentioned before, permitting is one possible outcome of the regulatory process, but that again requires the express reference in laws and regulation. And we wanted to reflect here on the case of some of the jurisdictions that are permitting the use of ISSB standards, and what are the differences between the permission and the requirement. And I think both probably Brazil and Nigeria represent similar situation where they are permitting the application, the use of ISSB standards as of 1st of January 2024, and they will be requiring later on some of the entities to apply on a mandatory basis ISSB standards. In the case of Brazil, it is listed entities from January 26. In the case of Nigeria, they've determined a phased-in approach when they will be requiring public interest entities from 2028 going forward, including SMEs as of 2030. Other jurisdictions have not determined that they will move to a mandatory regime. That's the case, for instance, in El Salvador, where they have already noted that they will be permitting the use of ISSB standards as of 1 January 2025. So again, different features, different regulatory process that will lead to different outcomes, some more on a transitional manner, some others on a more permanent basis until they make a final determination. We can move to the next slide. Leanne, again, just trying to reflect on how some of the jurisdictions are making use of existing laws or regulations and evolving them. I think For instance, just wanted to reflect on the case of the UK, where I think the FCA had already required listed companies, and there's also requirements for large private companies to align with TCFD recommendations. And again, the UK is right now going through the endorsement process. The Financial Conduct Authority, the capital markets a regulatory body, had already encouraged listed companies to start reporting in accordance with ISSB standards in a way to meet the existing TCFD requirements, even though they will be formulating new regulations once the UK has endorsed ISSB standards. A similar example is the case of Chile, where they had already mandated the use of TCFD and SASB standards, and they have evolved their regulation, what they call Norm 461, in order to ensure that those two frameworks are evolved and they make ISSB standards as the framework in order to be able to comply with Norm 461. In the case I mentioned before, Hong Kong and Singapore, they have been updating their listing rules to ensure that any sustainability related information that's required is being prepared on the basis of ISSB standards, starting with climate. We can move to the next slide. Again, some other matters for consideration. There are no specific outcomes here, but it is important for jurisdictions to reflect, again, what is the compliance basis, whether it will be mandatory, voluntary, and really important for a jurisdiction to consider whether their regulatory framework entails they do have a due process where they need to consult stakeholders. Again, there's no one size fits all. Some jurisdictions do have very prescriptive regulatory processes that entail consultation for minimum periods to ensure they do have a cost analysis issued in order to passing regulation. Some other times, standard setters do also have their own process. So it is important at the get-go for jurisdictions to consider what's really the due process that will underpin their adoption roadmap. We can move to the next slide. And again, I can probably just very briefly touch on this one. I think the importance of consultation, and we were presenting two cases where the two standard setters in Australia and Japan, they did publish inaugural standards, and again, they did adjust their approaches on the basis of the feedback received. So it is important that there is a proper consultative process in some instances where market participants have the chance to provide input. And again, they really reflected on the input received from the different market participants that were actually calling for a greater degree of alignment. So again, just trying to provide some pointers that may be useful for jurisdictions in deciding how they can take steps going forward. We can move to the next slide, Eliane. I think we've covered the adoption process already. What's really the mechanism initially on our ongoing basis, keeping in mind that standards are likely to evolve and change over time. This is the case, for instance, most of you will be familiar with IFRS accounting standards. There's a process where standards are updated on an ongoing basis, and it is relevant for a jurisdiction to ensure it has a process to do the same for sustainability-related standards. Let's perhaps move into the next slide. I think this is important, and it covers, I think, some of the discussions we've had before. I wanted to put emphasis perhaps on the adoption readiness model, because we've seen this has been very prevalent in a number of Asian jurisdictions. For instance, in Malaysia, the different authorities that do have a role with respect to the adoption of ISSB standards, they came together under what they've called the Advisory Committee of Sustainability Reporting, including the Securities Commission, the Stock Exchange, the bank, I think, and the standard setter. They were the ones supporting the issuance of the National Sustainability Reporting Framework. Similarly, in Hong Kong, all the relevant authorities came together under the cross-agency steering group, including the Stock Exchange, the Securities Regulator, the Monetary Authority. So this is a process that's prevalent where different authorities are responsible for different regulated entities, including how they progress with their general purpose financial reporting. we've covered that as well in other jurisdictions, and I've mentioned again, the professional accountancy bodies tend to be really prevalent, I think, in Africa. And again, there's also consideration in some jurisdictions as to what is the role of the government, the policymakers versus other regulators. So let's move to the next slide. Again, we invite all of you that will be considering moving ahead on the issuance of a roadmap or regulations of standards to approach the IFRS Foundation both on any proposals you may have for translating ISSB standards or for ensuring you have the licensing arrangements so that you can make use of the IFRS Foundation intellectual property for defining, I think, your framework. And there are different regimes. The information is available on the roadmap development tool online, and we have a dedicated team that can help you if you have questions. So don't hesitate to approach us if you have any particular questions you may want to raise. We can move to the next slide. Again, just trying to give some context. You will see that probably the easiest adoption approaches is that where jurisdictions are adopting by reference. This basically means that they have included regulation where they just refer to ISSB standards without reproducing content or making modifications. And there are a number of jurisdictions that have followed that process. That's probably the easiest licensing arrangement, probably also the one that doesn't entail any fees. I mean, there are other approaches where jurisdictions will be making use of the content in ISSB standards to develop their local standards or the local regulations. And again, there are translations involved and there are licensing arrangements to ensure that jurisdictions can make use of the content, and also there are provisions as to how they can refer to ISSB standards when they develop their own content. So we're reaching the end, I think, of this session. Let's move to the next slide and let's perhaps take some questions before we do a little break.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. There is a question I will read. So this is a question regarding the interpretation of a regulatory, or legal instrument. If a stock exchange is a private entity rather than a regulatory authority, will the implementation of the ISSB standard through stock exchange regulation still be considered as being implemented via a regulatory or legal instrument?
Thank you very much for the question. And certainly many stock exchanges, financial market infrastructures tend to be regulated entities themselves. So certainly those stock exchanges that do have the responsibility and the mandate, and they have the authority to issue listing rules, generally they tend to do so under the umbrella of the securities regulator, which is the oversight body that determines what's really the regime prevailing for listed companies, issuers, and so on. Again, jurisdictions, regulators will need to look into their own regime. The fact that it is still a private entity subject to regulation doesn't prevent them from issuing the listing rules if those are part of the authorities that have been granted to the listing venue. So that is why it is important for jurisdictions to reflect on what is really my regulatory framework. How do the different bodies interact? What are the dependencies? Does the stock exchange need to consult and get authority from the securities regulator before issuing listing rules? So again, we cannot determine the process. We just invite jurisdictions to consider how they need to go along. If the stock exchange has the vested powers to determine listing rules for listed entities, which happen to be the reporting entities that we believe should probably come in first, those are, in our view, authoritative sources. Listing rules do have the power of being equivalent to laws and regulations because they do prescribe what is the regime that will prevail for certain entities. So yeah, we're treating listed stock exchanges as regulatory authorities, even though we do understand that some have different ownership structures.
Yes, thank you very much. So I suggest we now pause for 10 minutes. Let's meet again at 4:40 p.m. Tokyo time to continue this presentation. Thank you again. Okay, so welcome back to the webinar. Jonathan, if you are ready, we can continue.
Excellent. I am ready, but I have the pleasure of handing over to Yelling to cover the second pillar, the second R, reporting entities.
Thank you.
Eliane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm going to take you going through the reporting entities. So when a jurisdiction making policy determinations on the introduction of sustainability-related disclosure requirements, now you need to determine which entities will be subject to this requirement. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so in our jurisdictional guide, you can say that we have like 3 features address who will be subject to reporting requirements. So whether they are all or most domestic publicly accountable bodies, entities that what we call PAEs, are subject to disclosure requirements. In jurisdictional guide, we have like a comprehensive explanations in terms of what are the definition of PAEs. So PAEs include entities whose securities are publicly traded, or those that hold assets in a fiduciary capacity for a broad group of outsiders as one of the primary business. And also these entities that have a significant weight in the jurisdiction, regardless of entity's ownership structure or listed status. So we have this paragraph 113 to 115 address this in the jurisdictional guide. And the second feature is talking about whether requirements should apply to all segments of the market, with particular focus on the first and the second tiers, that when we describe the jurisdiction's approach on adoption or other use of ISSB standards, our focus will be looking at the first and the second tiers. The third feature is that whether requirements pertain to the same reporting entity for financial statements and sustainability-related financial information. So I will explain that a bit more later. So these are the 3 features we will look into. Next slide, please. So decisions on which entities will be subject to sustainability-related disclosure requirement will depend on jurisdiction's overall policy rationale for such disclosures. Each jurisdiction will have to consider the most appropriate approach based on its regulatory system and the jurisdictional arrangement. These are jurisdictional efficiencies in approaches that rely on the standard setting process and the resulting quality of ISSB standards, and thereby avoiding developing a costly, complex local process. And to decide who are the relevant entities in the jurisdictional guide, that we focus on the extent to which PAEs are subject to requirement, consistent with the IFI's Foundation's objective to set standards that provide relevant information that is useful to investors and other participants in the capital markets. That's why we said we focused on the publicly accountable entities. So some jurisdictions also decide whether they will take phased-in approach or scale requirements for certain categories of entities based on the market readiness. So that will be further addressed later in our presentation. So we see a lot of jurisdictions that, for example, they will subject or most domestic public accountable entities to the jurisdictional requirements first, and then further expand those requirements to other listed companies and also even to the non-listed companies. So that is taking over time. Compliance also with ISSB standards requires that reporting entity for sustainability-related disclosure be for the same entity as that used for financial statements in the general purpose financial reports. For example, whether the requirements apply only to consolidated information. According to our IFRS S1's requirements, to use the same reporting entity for both financial statements and the sustainability-related financial disclosure, enable information disclosed in the financial statement to be connected with the sustainability-related financial information. So this is an important angle that's for jurisdiction to consider as well. Next slide, please. This slide lists the various decision points related to the reporting entities. So they include questions about intended to identify the PAEs, as well as other entities that might be subject to requirements. For example, whether all at once or over time. They also include considerations of requirements for foreign entities that are PAEs listed in the jurisdiction's capital market. They consider the effective date, also address that who will be required first and over what kind of a longer period. So that's something to consider. And the requirements that you can see at the outcome bit, that the green part, the requirements that apply to all or most PAEs aligns with our jurisdictional guide's description of a fully adopting approach. Next slide, please. I forgot to mention that all those questions that above in the previous slide we have a comprehensive description and explanation in the roadmap development to that document. So welcome to refer to the details. So on this slide, we provide some context that how jurisdictions really take this into the practice. So for example, we can see Turkey. We can see that public PAEs that are required is above a certain size, and to introduce most entities listed on the first tier and taking a phased-in approach. Australia requirement introduced to group 1 to 3 of reporting entities, also including the most PAEs. Mexico excludes financial institutions, which may be PAEs if listed or of a significant weight in the jurisdiction. Bangladesh, as an example, that only require banks and financial institutions only. So you can see that those questions, that jurisdiction had the kind of journey of considering their market readiness and with the comprehensive development journey to decide on those entities are the one who will be determined in the first phase. Next slide, please. Also, on this slide, the matters for consideration in relation to the market segments. Jurisdictions' market structures have various tiers or segmentation among listed entities. Our foundation will describe approaches only based on what is applicable to the first, which normally seen as primary, premier, or senior market board, and the second, a standard board tier of the capital markets. So this recognize that the third tier, for example, in some market will be the growth market or entering or venture market tiers are frequently subject to less stringent reporting requirements or being given a longer kind of transition period for being mandatory eventually. So key point here in terms of the outcome to consider is that also whether all or most entities in the first and second tiers aligned with the jurisdiction guide's description of fully adopting approach. So next slide, please. Further matters for consideration in terms of the reporting entity. Reporting entity here, we refer to, as we mentioned, whether it compliant with ISSB standards requirement in IFRS S1, that sustainability-related financial disclosure will be required for the same reporting entity as for the related financial statements. So we know that in the IFRS S1, so reporting entity, this one is the requirement. We also, the matters for consideration and the questions on this slide address that all of this aspect in the IFRS 1. And also this will be the requirement that apply to the jurisdictional guides full adoption approach. So it is a really critical consideration. Next slide, please. Providing an example in terms of the reporting entity, so we can have a kind of like more understanding here. So last year, Malaysia released its national sustainability reporting framework that they considered that transition relief requiring climate-related disclosures initially only on principal business segments on the reporting entity. That entails changes to the scope of disclosures required by the ISSB standards, which may result in lack of consistency between the entity's financial statements, which will be, like we mentioned, on a company-wide basis in a consolidated way, and their related climate-related risks and opportunities, which will be on a subset of a reporting entity, as only information on primary business segments will be delivered. So during this transitional period, these transitional modifications may hinder investors' ability to fully draw connections with the financial statements during the period where this transition relief, as the climate-related information would only cover parts of the reporting entity that is reflected in the financial statements. So this will also would also reduce the comparability between information provided by entities in Malaysia using the transition reliefs and those using the ISSB standards in other jurisdictions. So this is an example that we can see why the same reporting entity towards the financial statements is important. So any questions in this section?
Jialing, no, so far no questions, so you can continue.
So next one, I think we will invite Jonathan to talk about.
Sorry, there is one, sorry, it just appeared. Jialing, do you know, or could you share what percentage of the total market capitalization or number of listed companies are required to report in Turkey and Australia, and which are, because those countries are classified under the most PAEs category. If you do not know the exact amount, if you can just share an average number.
I don't think we have an average number here that we can provide to you, because each jurisdiction have a very different status. And also this, like we mentioned, that market segments are very different. So I think when we publish our jurisdictional profile, that we will have more detailed information, so that give a level of transparency that market can refer to. Then you can see that actually it's really like what we said, that the jurisdictions will assess that and decide on who are the PAEs or who are the like markets, what are the market segments. It depends on the market readiness and their own kind of like status, and it's a sovereign decision. But what we can do is to provide a level of transparency to the market. So Jonathan, is there anything that you wanted to add on that?
Yeah, perhaps just very quickly, we have certainly gathered information from both jurisdictions in order to determine whether we deem there was sufficient market cap being captured in the initial cohorts that were being onboarded. But again, we don't think the jurisdictional profiles will include that level of detail. That's information that has been provided to us by different jurisdictions, and it's probably up to them to determine whether they want to make that information publicly available. But again, I guess that generally most stock exchanges do publish information about their market cap, and those entities that belong to a certain cohort can probably be tracked. We do have those details, but allow us not to share that information publicly, given it's been shared with us on a confidential basis by the different jurisdictions.
Thank you very much.
But maybe in the public information regime that we saw, for example, like Hong Kong SAR jurisdictions, the roadmap last year that clearly declared that they will require their large cap listed companies, which will present like 75% of their markets in the listed capital market. So that is like an open kind of resource already published, so people can perhaps refer to their websites. Yeah.
Okay. There is another question. Someone highlighted the interesting difference between Mexico and Bangladesh, as one country decided to focus on listed companies, while the other one focuses more on banks and financial institutions. What considerations drive such different approaches from your perspective?
May I take this one, Yeling? I think in the case of Bangladesh, I think, again, it was the central bank that spearheaded efforts because they felt they were more ready to do so. We do understand as well that the Securities Commission is also following developments and they are considering whether to expand or not. So again, it's a jurisdiction that where an authority decides to move ahead. And this is why we are suggesting that at the outset, it's important for the relevant authorities to get together to ensure there is a reasonable approach. In the case of Mexico, it is the other way around. Still the same authority that has the potential, because it's the Banking and Securities Authority. I think in Mexico, they have taken an initial step in order for listed entities to being required to report against ISSB standards, but I know they are considering when and how to expand the scope to cover financial institutions. Again, just to make very clear that in the jurisdictional guide, and I think it's paragraph 113, we noted for the purpose of the jurisdictional guide, which are the entities that we believe have public accountability, which entail both listed entities as well as those financial institutions, asset managers, insurance companies, commercial banks that do have some fiduciary functions and do have a role in the financial sector. So again, for a jurisdiction to be considered, it has addressed requirements for publicly accountable entities. They will need to include both. So we do understand that in the case of Mexico and Bangladesh, yes, opposite approaches, but that is being taken as an initial step for a more comprehensive approach. I think there was also another question talking about the role of prudential authorities, and just to make very clear that our standards, the disclosures that are required by ISSB standards are intended to feature in general purpose financial reports. We do understand, as it is the case with financial reporting, that prudential authorities may add an additional prudential disclosure regime for financial institutions. In some cases, that is in addition and over and above general purpose financial reporting. So this is disclosures that are intended to address the needs of the prudential authority to determine the safety, soundness, and stability of the financial institutions and the financial system as a whole. In other instances, the prudential authority, the central bank, the monetary authorities have the power to determine general purpose financial reporting for financial institutions. In any event, given the relevance of financial institutions for both prudential reporting and general purpose financial reporting, we believe there is a need for suitable coordination between those regulators that are involved in the different regulatory stances on financial institutions. So any reporting that is required over and above general purpose financial reporting, that is not covered by ISSB standards. We believe that ISSB standards provide the foundations, the grounding to support prudential reporting, which is why the Basel Committee and the recommendations they issued, I think at the end of 23, the draft recommendations, I think they still haven't finalized. They were building the climate-related regime on the basis of IFRS 2, but that is on top and above. But we believe there's a need for coordination, which is why we have been engaging with the Basel Committee as well as the IAS and the FSB and others to ensure there is proper concordance between the different requirements so that we don't end up with fragmentation at different regulatory levels.
Thank you very much. So I suggest we continue the presentation. Jialing, over to you.
Yeah, the next part will be delivered by Jonathan.
Sorry.
Excellent.
Over to
Let's
you,
move then
Jonathan.
to the third R, requirements. And this is an important aspect because it's looking into quite a number of features in the jurisdictional guide, which are really what will be the package of requirements that will be introduced into the regulatory regime. And it's important to look here into the degree of alignment, whether jurisdictions may be considering modifications, and we'll touch on that, whether there are any additional disclosure requirements. And there was a question before on how requirements to address the needs of other stakeholders or to meet specific policy objectives, for instance, taxonomy related, what's really the placement of disclosures. And I was touching on that with the general purpose financial reports and other disclosure requirements that build from general purpose financial reports, but have other purposes. And I won't spend too much time on the reporting. Let's perhaps move into the next slide. And again, just looking into the features. Again, the degree of alignment, I think it's really important. And I think it's we are inviting jurisdictions to reflect on the extent to which ISSB standards are fully transposed into regulatory frameworks, whether it is adopting by reference or whether they are actually replicating content in our standards by developing local standards. And if they are not fully transposed, what's the degree of alignment of those local standards or requirements in ISSB standards? Again, we're looking into jurisdictional modifications. I think we've made very clear that these are defined by the jurisdictional guide as changes to or exemption from requirements in ISSB standards other than transition adoption reliefs. We have taken adoption reliefs and this as a separate stance because we already noted in the jurisdictional guide that jurisdictions may consider the suitability of extending transition reliefs, again, for those reliefs that have already been included in IFRS 1 and IFRS 2. And I'm sure you touched on those later on. So we've called those transition standard reliefs, and extension of those reliefs are defined in the jurisdictional guide as transition adoption relief. So those are not considered to be jurisdictional modifications. If we can move to the next slide. Again, we'll be covering whether the permission or requirement to have additional disclosures introduced obscure information required by ISSB standards, whether information that intends to support decision-making by primary users of general purpose financial reports, investors, creditors, lenders, whether they have information that's clearly identifiable and not obscured. And that entails, of course, volume, but it also entails a presentation. And one of the things we're hearing repeatedly and recurrently from investors is that for them, it's absolutely fundamental that information that's deemed to be material as defined by ISSB standards for decision-making can be central, can be clearly identified, and it's not buried in really voluminous disclosures that prevents them from having proper access. So that's another aspect that's important to consider, and it touches as well on how jurisdictions can build a building blocks approach that takes into consideration the needs of investors and others. So those considerations around not obscuring, which are central in IFRS 1, will be fundamental in, I think, our review and jurisdictional considerations. I'll skip dual reporting because we do understand that some jurisdictions will be looking into that. But one aspect there is, of course, what's the placement and the timing of disclosures. And again, just to note, as I mentioned, our disclosures are intended to be included in general purpose financial reports, are intended to be read in conjunction with financial statements so that investors can actually reflect on the connectivity on both. What are the financial prospects? What are the anticipated financial and current effects of sustainability-related disclosures, and how they can assess and price sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and how that determines their investment or disinvestment positions. We can move to the next slide again. So some of the guidance there is we believe that adherence to a global reporting framework is an important determinant of investors, capital providers confident in the market disclosure regime. And again, we've seen this in the accounting financial reporting domain with over 140 jurisdictions requiring IFRS accounting standards. I think we've got to a point where we can confidently say we do have a global language for financial reporting, and I think there is proper acknowledgement and recognition of the value that jurisdictional adherence to that global reporting language brings to the capital markets. I think I've mentioned already what we have defined as jurisdictional modifications, and I think it's important to note that the guide cautions against modifications because they will have an impact on the delivery of timely, comparable, consistent information. And again, it is important that we reflect on, these are lessons learned, I think, from the accounting field, that once jurisdictions introduce exemptions, modifications, carve-outs, it is challenging then to bring things back. And we were in the process of convergence with IFRS accounting standards for years. So it would be good for jurisdictions to reflect how we can mitigate the fragmentation that can be caused from the get-go, and try to consider whether modifications are actually justified or whether those should be really treated as transitional elements to support the onboarding on companies to ensure they are successful in delivering high quality disclosure. So that is, again, very central in the roadmap development tool. It will be very central in the way we look into jurisdictional approaches and how we define them in the jurisdictional profiles. And again, we need to ensure that as it is required in ISSB standards, that meeting the information needs of investors remains central. So any additional disclosures need to be designed, need to be framed, need to be required, that are presented in a way that they do not obscure information required by ISSB standards. And this is important because certainly there is a requirement in IFRS S1, and it will be important for the assurance framework. It will be important for how investors read disclosures being presented by companies, that a company is required to assert compliance with ISSB standards if they have observed all the requirements in ISSB standards, including the one around non-obscuring information. That's central for investors. So if we can move to the next slide. Again, so matters for consideration, I think it's a determination whether standards will be fully incorporated, and if not, the degree of alignment. So I think there are several decision points for jurisdictions to consider: whether the standards will be required right away, whether they will be limited to the climate-related requirements in ISSB standards. If jurisdictions opt for a climate only approach, is this just an initial transitional approach, or is it a long-term permanent approach? Will they be expanding the scope to cover all sustainability-related matters, or they will just stick to climate? And again, an important element that I'll cover later on: if a jurisdiction doesn't fully incorporate or directly adopts by reference ISSB standards, whether they will design standards or requirements that will deliver functionally aligned outcomes, or climate-related or align with the climate-related requirements in ISSB standards. So again, the different range of outcomes, may result with standards or requirements not being functionally aligned, which may determine a different approach, maybe partially incorporating ISSB standards. It may also result in adopting the climate requirements in ISSB standards, or it may result in full alignment with ISSB standards. Again, describing as well standards or requirements that are designed to deliver functionally aligned outcomes. So different range of outcomes, and that will determine very much whether how jurisdictions will be described. And let me note, as I mentioned before, I think there was a question that there may be approaches, but that may have a climate-first approach. So jurisdictions that will initially be adopting the climate requirements in ISSB standards, but have determined that their target is to fully adopt ISSB standards. So they will be completing milestones over time until they reach to that final destination, which is fully adopting. So all approaches are suitable for describing both the current status as well the stated jurisdictional target. If we can move to the next slide, and you've heard me already a few times talk about functionally aligned outcomes. So again, this is really to ensure that primary users of general purpose financial reports receive the same information and outcomes than those resulting from the application of ISSB standards. So we noted they need to meet the criteria that were articulated in the conceptual foundations, core content, and general requirements in IFRS S1. However, the determination will need to be made on a case-by-case basis, again, looking not just to features individually and in isolation, but the review of all the features all together. And very importantly, the focus is really on the outcomes, is not on the form. So we do understand, we acknowledge that jurisdictions will have their own pathways to move ahead. So let me move into the next slide, and we've tried to sort of provide some pointers as to elements that we believe need to be embedded into the requirements for them to be considered that are designed to deliver functional aligned outcomes. One, of course, is the definition of material information, which needs to be aligned with IFRS S1. And again, for those jurisdictions that may have approaches with respect to materiality that also address the needs of other stakeholders, the definition of material information for primary users, for investors, needs to be distinct and aligned with that in IFRS S1. So again, that touches very much on what we've been talking about, the additional or incremental disclosures, which we've noted very clearly that they need to be designed in a way that information that's material for primary users is not obscured. So this needs to be clearly stated in the requirements. It cannot result just by application by the company. So the regulatory regime needs to make this provision explicit. In terms of some of the key parameters that are in IFRS S1, timing, location, and reporting entity, we do understand that sometimes the regulatory regime has standards, but then there is regulatory provisions that determine the application of the standards. So we will be looking into the overall package, the standards themselves, and how the standards are determined to be applied. So we will be looking, and I think jurisdictions need to be, we are encouraging jurisdictions to look into how the sustainability-related financial disclosures are provided at the same time as the financial statements, precisely to enable investors, primary users, to be able to cross over and compare both, and they need to be included again in general purpose financial reports, precisely for the same reason, so that that is part of the package that investors assess in order to determine their investment decisions. And it needs to be for the same reporting entity as for the financial statements. I think Yelling was covering that. So there may be elements where the reporting entity changes, whether because regulation determines a different perimeter, different boundaries for the reporting entity, which happen to be different from those of the entity that's being used for the purpose of financial statements. Again, we are encouraging jurisdictions to consider the financial statements together with the sustainability information, both for the same reporting entity. In terms of the core content, and you touched yesterday that both IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 embed the TCFD recommendations and structure. So any requirements will need to ensure that the elements on information, structure, governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics is already included and embedded in the framework. Connectivity and connected information, it's also important. So we believe that requirements will need to include the disclosure of information that enables investors to understand the current and anticipated financial effects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities on the entity's business model and value chain. In terms of the scope, again, we'll need to look into whether it is an all-encompassing sustainability approach, so both risks and opportunities need to be required, and whether it covers all sustainability topics or it's limited just to climate. An important component there is that any framework will need to ensure that it requires the need to disclose industry-specific information. This is because investors have, again, repeatedly mentioned that they will be comparing peers within the same industries, and they have mentioned that given sustainability-related risks and opportunities vary in accordance with the sector in which the company operates, it's very different to compare the sustainability risks of an airline than a food producer. That needs to be central in the process. And again, the requirements should include the consideration and applicability of the disclosure topics in SASB standards. So those are the parameters that are in IFRS 1 that will need to be incorporated into the standards or requirements, so that those are designed to deliver outcomes that are functionally aligned with ISSB standards. If we can move to the S2 related components. So again, materiality, it is important as well that that's embedded as well for jurisdictions that may be following a climate first approach. In terms of GHG emissions, it is again paramount, I think, for jurisdictions to consider what's the scope. But in order to deliver requirements that are functionally aligned with ISSB standards, there will be a need to include requirements for the disclosure of scope 1, 2, and 3 of GHG emissions. And again, what's the measurement framework that's being used for GHG emissions? And again, we noted very clearly in IFRS 2, that's the Greenhouse Gas Protocol A, Corporate Accounting and Reporting Standard 2004, which will need to be required unless, again, building on the provision in IFRS 2, unless the jurisdiction's laws and regulations require another measurement framework. We were very cognizant in the basis for conclusions that we didn't want jurisdictions that were already prescribing a different measurement framework to introduce a new requirement that would result in duplication. So there is that provision that's included in IFRS 2. If that's not the case, again, it is central that the GHG protocol is used as the measurement framework and is explicitly referenced in the regulations. You probably touched yesterday when you were covering scope 3 GHG emissions, that there are specific provisions in IFRS 2 relating to entities that have activities in the asset management, commercial banking, or insurance sectors. There's a requirement to provide information about category 15 on GHG that are associated with finance emissions. So that's, again, a requirement that will need to feature in in the local framework. Again, transition and plans and targets. Probably yesterday you covered that our standards do not prescribe the need to have targets or transition plans, but if an entity, either because it does on a voluntary basis or because there are other laws or regulations that prescribe having transition plans or targets, the jurisdictional requirements will need to introduce a requirement for the disclosure of the targets and information about transition plans in order to deliver functional and outcomes. So again, to be clear, we do not prescribe that there should be a specific provisions on targets on transition plans for companies, but rather if those are in place for the disclosure of those. And again, in terms of resilience and scenario analysis, there will be a need for consideration of a requirement to have scenario analysis in order to determine the entity's strategy and resilience, how the business model is to climate-related change. So those are basically the two building blocks of the parameters that we'll be considering in order to determine whether requirements or standards are designed to provide functionally aligned outcomes. We can move to the next slide. So again, different circumstances here, just showing some examples. I think Brazil, again, what they've done is basically reproduce the content in ISSB standards by the issuance of Brazilian specific standards. That's basically, let's say, just the branding of our standards under a Brazilian layer. Of course, they are translated into Brazilian, but it's basically the same standards that prevail. So there is an inherent degree of alignment by the fact that they have used the content in ISSB standards to develop translated version of their standards. In the case of Australia, they have introduced requirements for climate-related financial information starting in January 25. However, they have for now not included a requirement to provide industry-specific information. However, they have mentioned that the standard setter, the ISSB, will be initiating a project to consider the inclusion of that information. So that's expected to begin relatively soon. So again, they have, for the time being, left that aside, but they have already signaled that their target is actually to consider the mandatory application of industry-specific requirements. So again, in the case of Indonesia, they issued, I think they consulted markets on their exposure drafts. They had mentioned they would be making modifications on the use of GICS, which anyway, it's something that the ISSB has already identified that it will be already looking to change. So that is an aspect where in discussions with them, they had already identified there was something that we would be changing in respect of IFRS 2. And in the case of Hong Kong, they have issued, again, listing rules, Appendix 27, which incorporate some of the requirements, both in IFRS 1 and IFRS 2, but in the long term, they have already determined and they have issued Hong Kong standards that are fully aligned and converged with ISSB standards. And again, that was really motivated by the fact that Hong Kong is one of the most relevant capital markets, I think, in Asia. They wanted to ensure that the information flowing from their companies was fully aligned with the global baseline. We can move to the next slide, please. Again, so jurisdictional modifications, and I think it's important here again to consider carefully the implications of potential modifications, or whether this need to be just considered as transitional reliefs, and whether investors, those that will be receiving information, have been consulted, and whether they believe that any modifications will result in information. And again, we think it's important here to note that we will not be treating as modifications perhaps the deactivation of certain options that are included in ISSB standards. So the fact that a jurisdiction, let's say, shuts down one of the options that's included in ISSB standards will not be deemed to be a modification. And I think also importantly, we will be looking into the pervasiveness and the extent of the modifications. This is again something that we'll need to assess on a case-by-case basis, because some modifications may only affect a very small subset of entities. So we will be looking comprehensively into modifications. But again, jurisdictions need to be mindful of the implications and consequences of any modifications being made. So in terms of outcomes, extensive modifications will probably result in jurisdictions not being able to fully adopt ISSB standards. In the case of limited modifications, again, whether it is just shutting down one of the options, or whether that modification is really determined not to be pervasive, not to impair the degree of alignment, I think that can still enable jurisdictions to fully adopt ISSB standards. And again, with no modifications or no significant modifications, I think those are the outcomes that will result from jurisdiction's decision. We can move to next slide. I'll probably just skip some of this examples and maybe move into let's skip this one. Let's skip this one as well. Here again, additional requirements. I think we've covered this one sufficiently through, I think, the presentation. But again, it's important to know that in terms of the outcomes, we'll be looking into whether the volume of additional disclosures has the potential to obscure information by ISSB standards, or whether the presentation of additional disclosures is such that it challenges the possibility of investors to clearly identify those disclosures are deemed to be material. So not being able to meet that test of ensuring that additional disclosures do not obscure information required by ISSB standards is likely to result in different approaches, but not fully adopting ISSB standards, most likely partially incorporating ISSB standards. And again, there are different options, and we note very clearly that there's an option to require additional information, and to the extent that this information on the presentation, if it doesn't obscure information required by ISSB standards, a jurisdictional approach can still be described as fully adopting ISSB standards. So again, just wanted to make sure why this provision around not obscuring is so relevant, because in our standards do enable that building blocks approach, including adding informational requirements to address the needs of other stakeholders. But that needs to be done in a way that presentation-wise, volume-wise, it doesn't obscure information. So let's move perhaps, I'll skip that one. I'll skip dual reporting as well. And again, I'll look into placement of disclosures. Again, we've covered this one as well. And we have a quote, I think, in the slide reflecting on what we mean by general purpose financial reports, which it is included in IFRS as one. It is also referenced in the jurisdictional guide. It is referenced in the roadmap development tool. General purpose financial reports may include financial statements, management commentary, MD&A, sustainability-related financial disclosures, which again can be contained in an entity's sustainability disclosure document. And this is fundamental because both together enable investors, creditors, lenders to be able to make informed decisions. So there are questions, I think, and decision points for jurisdictions around the placement. They will need to determine whether whatever report form is part of the general purpose financial report package. And the timing of as well is really critical, whether those disclosures will be released at the same time as the related financial statements. And again, here, probably placement and timing come closely together. There are already provisions in IFRS S1 regarding the possibility to defer the publication of the sustainability report after the financial statements. Some jurisdictions may decide to use that as a transitional component. They may extend reliefs, but again, ultimately, the information needs to be together with the financial information and delivered at the same time. So fully adopting jurisdictions will be ones that ensure that both in terms of placement and timing, they've included those components. So before we move into the final decision area, the fourth R on readiness, let me see whether there are any questions coming from the audience.
Jonathan, no, there is not specific question on this part. So you can continue.
Can I ask a question?
Agnes.
Yes, Professor Shirai, please go ahead.
Thank you, Jonathan and Gillian. You mentioned about the importance of GHG emission data and in the industry-based metrics. Now, in S2, there is a cross-industry metrics, 7 metrics, including GHG emission. So I just wonder how important those 7 metrics. I understand GHG emission is important, but there is also indicators such as a percentage of asset subject to physical risk or like subject to transition risk and opportunities. So how important those 6 cross-industry metrics?
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Shirai, I think, for the question. Again, when we were touching on those parameters that we believe are fundamental in order to determine the degree of alignment, we were not intending to suggest that any other information that's included in ISSB standards is not relevant. It's not that those are the only components that need to be embedded. Those are perhaps those elements where we are putting the focus because we see that jurisdictions are somehow deliberating on how those would be incorporating all the information that's required in accordance with IFRS standards, including IFRS 2, it's there for a reason as our basis for conclusions determined. That is information that is part of our extensive consultation process, as part of our engagement with different regulators, with investors, with entities. It was deemed to be relevant for investor decision making, which is why it is included in ISSB standards. When it comes to industry specific related metrics, our standards require, again, that industry specific information should be disclosed, and we require entities to refer to and consider the SASB standards on the industry-based guidance in IFRS 2. But again, an entity may determine that some of the disclosure topics and some of their metrics are not applicable to it in light of its business model. So it is not that we're prescribing all those metrics need to be captured and included in the report. That needs to be, of course, taken from the materiality lens, from the business model that an entity has, from its activities, and whether any information is deemed to be material. This is not a pure, merely compliance exercise where an entity should run through all the metrics and tick the box and include them. It is intended to follow a proper materiality assessment where an active call is made to determine whether that information is actually going to impact the way investors look into that information. But the process, it is mandatory in terms of reflecting on the industry-based considerations, reflecting on whether the disclosure topics and the metrics are material. And then the entity has the prerogative to determine whether any of that is material and should be included. Again, we tend to look very much into SASB standards, industry-based guidance as a comprehensive set of requirements. My own perspective, and here I'm talking my own voice, not on behalf of the ISSB, is that at a time where we're actually trying to build capacity and provide guidance to companies, that is a very useful set of guidance for companies to be able to determine which are material sustainability risks and opportunities, and what is a properly structured thought process to be followed to determine which information should be displaced. So if we remove perhaps the emphasis on the requirements and try to look into SASB standards and the industry-based guidance as guidance to support companies in their journey to provide information, I think that may change perhaps the perspective as to how companies are addressing that. I hope I've covered, Professor Shirai, your question suitably.
Thank you.
Yeah, there is one more question, if I may. So from a participant, if the disclosure becomes mandatory in certain jurisdiction, should there be a penalty on entities that could not meet some requirement of the guideline? Do you think it's a good measure? If yes, to which level? Some of the requirements are objective. How much to disclose is enough? Yeah, so what is your view about that?
Right, so two questions embedded in one. One is how a company determines what information is material. The other one is what is an enforcement supervisory sanctioning regime on top of that. Let me know that, in order to how to determine whether information is suitable or not. I mean, there's probably a process, and I think we cannot forget that it's management's responsibility to determine which information is material and what information is intended to meet the needs of its shareholders and investors and other entities that do have an interest in the company. So management cannot actually shy away from that responsibility, and that entails that they need to have in place processes, internal controls, audit committees, risk committees, those charged with governance that will have a role in determining the reporting considerations, I think, for an entity. I think we cannot also forget or put aside that in many jurisdictions, there will be gradually an assurance regime being introduced that will have the responsibility to challenge, question, ask whether the disclosures that are being presented are fair, representative, whether the framework that has been applied has been used properly in the context of the assurance framework, whether it's limited, reasonable, or in the audit space, whether it is a full audit. And I think we need to be very clear about ensuring we understand the expectations. There's different scope. So they will render different results. But there is already a precursor where there will be an attestation mechanism for those disclosures. And eventually, ultimately, in a mandatory regime, supervisors and enforcers are the final gatekeepers to ensure that there is a degree of investor protection and the information flowing into the markets is suitable. I think, again, as we noted in the roadmap development tool, we're inviting jurisdictions, supervisors to consider what is a proportionate approach towards enforcement and sanctioning. And again, we need to be cognizant we're starting to learn a language. And again, probably I'm not particularly gifted with languages, but it takes some time to become fully proficient, and you make a lot of mistakes in the process. And of course, it's important that there is a mechanism to correct, I think, those mistakes. But some jurisdictions, I think Australia is a good example, they have introduced modified liability for a period of time so that they're inviting companies to explore the boundaries of what is suitable information to be disclosed. We are in our process of engaging with regulators, inviting them to think about a proportionate phased-in approach towards enforcement that perhaps starts with supervision, surveillance, and that entails, rather than sanctioning right away companies for perhaps not getting it totally right at the beginning, ensure they do have a program where they bring the focus area on topics where they can actually support their reporting entities, enhancing the information that's being provided. And this is not new to sustainability reporting. In the financial reporting space, the introduction of any new standard means that there is a journey, a learning curve for companies to get ahead of the game. It wasn't that different when IFRS 9 was introduced. Many of you will recall disclosures were initially perhaps more qualitative. They moved into quantitative. I think market practice, the process with the auditors challenging that led to enhancements over time. And again, regulators, they cannot shy away from their responsibility, but we think it would be suitable to ensure that companies have the confidence to be able to disclose and explore a bit the process before they're confronted right away with sanctions. That can be a deterrent towards quality reporting. So again, it is for jurisdictions to determine based on our experience, based on what we have learned over years in the financial reporting space and what we've seen in some jurisdictions, we're inviting them to consider that. Having said that, it is an area that we're willing to explore with our regulatory related bodies, I mean, IOSCO, the jurisdictional working group, because it's an area that is increasing its relevance as jurisdictions have a better sense of how their frameworks will look like. But again, this is why it was included in the roadmap development tool.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So I suggest we continue and finalize the online training. So there is no more question in the chat. So over to you.
I'll pass on to Yelling to cover the final final decision point. Yelling, floor is yours.
Yelling, you're muted.
Yes. Sorry about that. Thank you, Agnes and Jonathan. So now this brings us to the final decision area, readiness. So namely assessment of the jurisdiction as to the market readiness for when the reporting requirements of sustainability related disclosures will be mandated. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at two features, effective date and transition reliefs. We know that in IFRS S1, we set requirements on effective dates and the transition reliefs. And here, what we're looking at is the jurisdictions that in their jurisdiction decisions, that the extent to which requirements refer to current effective ISSB standards, noting the transition relief that in IFRS S1. As a matter of our policy, jurisdictions will need to determine the date when requirements will be applied when within the jurisdiction. That will involve a series of considerations. And the transition reliefs, also apart from those set in our standards, that jurisdiction will also decide the extent and the nature of the jurisdictional modifications for example, the changes or exemptions from requirements in the ISSB standard, and also whether they will apply fully to what is already within the ISSB standards. That is based on their assessment to their market readiness. Next slide, please. So there are a few guidance the aspects that we consider. The time frame over which a jurisdiction decides to require sustainability-related disclosures can depend on the jurisdiction's assessment of its market readiness. The jurisdiction's assessment on market readiness will be influenced by jurisdiction's maturity in sustainability reporting and the entity's familiarity with voluntary sustainability-related reporting or frameworks. For example, if a jurisdiction has regulatory requirements already based on TCFD recommendations, SASB standards, or the integrated reporting framework, and these reporting frameworks and standards are widely used by the entities that in the jurisdiction, and over years that we can see those cases actually in a lot of markets in Asia as well. So the entities that will be those entities who will be subject to the requirement might be easier than transit to apply ISSB standards. So also the transition to ISSB standard might also be easier in the jurisdiction that's where GRI standards are widely used. So also relevant is that when the jurisdiction sets the effective date, will determine that when the entities and what portion of entities will be applied within the jurisdiction. Based on its assessment of its readiness and maturity, the jurisdiction might decide to phase in one of the standards or some elements of the ISSB standards over time. Such extensions might apply to all or most publicly accountable entities, or to one or more classes of publicly accountable entities. And over time, will maybe evolve to the full adoption to more kind of like entities. Also, capacity is something that we discuss a lot. We receive a lot of like feedback from the market that's consistently on those challenges in terms of, for example, data availabilities, and also high quality implementation issues. What is relevant is that to address those challenges actually is not only that responsibility of the entity itself, and also not only rely on the capabilities of the reporting entity itself, whether a market actually have a set like sustainability reporting ecosystem to support to support addressing those challenges will be very important. For example, the availability of sustainability related disclosure expertise, whether there are enough kind of like talents and trained, and also access to data service providers are in place, and also tools to analyze data, professional services and assurance providers, and the readiness of the regulators to supervise the market and enforce the sustainability related disclosure, form the ecosystem that can also help also determine market's readiness. So also based on the market readiness, so we also perhaps also need to look at those potential shortcomings within the strategy that do not result in the delivery of global comparable information or delay such comparability during the transition period. So we should probably consider that whether we are able to provide timely or fully full comparability of sustainability related information for investors, whether we are able to fully eliminating the risk of a jurisdiction's country or market discount until all the relevant requirements have been introduced. Entities with cross-border activities continuing to need to comply with potentially different requirements in another jurisdiction, which adds burden to the companies and also a challenge to the capabilities of entities. So that's something also need to consider. Next slide, please. So we know that in developing IFRS S1 and S2, the ISSB has sought to balance entities' needs and their state of readiness with investors' needs for enhanced transparency and comparability with respect to the information on which they base investment decisions. So we introduced the proportionality mechanism. We provided several provisions in IFRS S1 and S2, the concept of reasonable and supportable information that is available at the reporting date without undue cost or effort, as well as the concept of the skill, capabilities, and the resources available to the entities. The mechanisms are likely to be particularly helpful to entities that might be less able to comply with the disclosure requirements in the ISSB standards. And also we provided a transition standard reliefs from specific requirements in IFRS S1 and IFRS S2 in order to facilitate the initial application of these standards. So these temporary reliefs that, as we know in our standard, will be for the first year of annual reporting are available to all entities. So we also, given the pace of progress in adopting ISSB standard in different jurisdictions maybe vary. Jurisdictions could consider whether to scale or phase in the disclosure requirements based on various parameters, such as the size and the relevant preparedness of the entities and the industry and the market segments in which they operate. However, to ensure the provision of the global comparable information for capital markets, that it is recommended that phasing is limited to only the following transition standard relief, like climate first reporting, the timing of the reporting, the GHG protocol, and the scope 3 emissions, that only those 4 areas are relieved from the first year of annual reporting from the entities. Next slide, please. So considering the effective date, the jurisdiction, there are some matters for jurisdiction to consider. For instance, the date when the requirements will become effective, the extent to which requirements effective in the jurisdiction align with the disclosures that are currently required in the ISSB standards, whether one or several of the requirements in ISSB standards will be delayed. So this means a number of decision points must be taken regarding the date, timing, future requirements, scope of entities required to be effective at a specific date, and any plans to extend the date. The decisions may lead to possible outcomes of the requirement become effective far into the future, having a limited delay or being fully effective within a year that fully align with ISSB's standard requirements. Next slide, please. We can see several examples from jurisdictions that have already determined or still consulted on their adoption roadmaps regarding effective dates. For example, Turkey mandatory for PAs meeting the relevant threshold from 1st January 2024, and Brazil voluntary application of the ISSB standard is effective from 2024 to 2025, with the standard becoming mandatory for publicly accountable entities from 2026. And Uganda is working to a slightly longer time frame with voluntary application for PIEs, publicly interested entities, from 2028 and mandatory from 2029 as a result of the market readiness assessment and the determination. Next slide, please. In terms of the consideration on transition reliefs, a jurisdiction must then consider whether phasing is limited to transition standard relief, involving extension to certain transition standard relief, or deferring or delaying requirements, and the type of the extent of the reliefs that need to be considered. So this means decisions concerning whether local requirement include the transition reliefs included in the IFRS S1 and S2, whether they are extended, and which ones and any additional reliefs need to be included. A series of outcomes can be determined from these decisions, where jurisdiction includes relief to disclose required in the ISSB standards other than those included in the standards, or are extended beyond, for example, 5 years. This equates to jurisdictional modifications unless they do not prevent functionally aligned with the standard that Jonathan introduced earlier, where jurisdiction extended reliefs, but they will expire within 3 to 5 years, or does not require reference to ISSB standards for 5 years. So this is classified as a long extension of transition standard reliefs. Again, depends on the market readiness. Conversely, where the reliefs will expire within 1 to 3 years, this is classified as a limited extension. Next slide, please. So to date, jurisdictions have taken many different approaches as relevant to their own jurisdictional context as to transition reliefs. So for example, just quickly say that Brazil's transition relief, for example, are the same as those within the ISSB standards, where Turkey has brought in additional 1-year relief on scope 3. Sri Lanka, there's a 2-year relief on reporting, providing quantitative information on determining anticipated financial effects, with an additional 1-year relief from scope 3 and GHG emissions, and 2 years from scenario analysis. Yeah, I think that brings us to the end of this part. Any questions?
Thank you very much, Jialing, for this final part. I think that's it for now. Let's see if there are additional questions. Yeah, not really. So I will suggest. I mean, unless would you like to add anything, Jonathan or Jialing?
Perhaps just if we can progress to the next slide, I'll just hand over back to you so that we can wrap up. And again, just bringing it all together, just again a summary of the 4 decision areas in the roadmap development tool, which again reflect on the features in the jurisdictional guide. We've covered all of that. If we can move to the next slide, just an invitation again for participants to get familiar with the roadmap development tool, particularly those jurisdictions that are right now in the process of assessing when, how to adopt ISSB standards. And again, that reference to the roadmap templates, which will actually, we have covered all of the features. And again, we looked into the different range of outcomes that were possible. Again, here, this is just one template, but you have the 7 templates available so that you can contrast all those decisions. So the roadmap development tool intends to enable jurisdictions to be able to run through all those considerations, decision points, outcomes, and determine which are the areas where there is perhaps room for them to evolve if they really want to target fully adopting, or whether there are any transitional considerations. So just trying to bring all of that together, how the roadmap development tool can support you in your process. So with that, Agnes, let me turn back to you for the wrap up.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this summary and for this very comprehensive sessions. So I would like now to invite Hiroshi Komori-san, member of the ISSB board, and Professor Sayuri Shirai, ADBI advisor for sustainable policies, to wrap up the online training. Komori-san, would you like to share a few words?
Yes, thank you very much, Agnes. Hello again to all members and the partners who have attended two-day capacity building workshop on adoption of the ISSB standards. My colleague, Taeyang, and myself made a deep dive into the IFAS S1 and S2 yesterday. And today, as you see, Jonathan and Jeline provided practical presentation based on inaugural jurisdiction guide and roadmap and development too. I really hope our sessions proved helpful to you all. I should say, however, as your questions today and yesterday amplified, it's not easy at all. And no one size fits all, as Jonathan pointed repeatedly. So that is why I think ADBI and ADB kindly hosted a workshop this time. And on behalf of the ISSB, we very much appreciate the workshop. The three ISSB board members from the Asia-Oceania region, including myself, are based in Tokyo and Beijing, with internal cooperation with Jonathan's team to support jurisdictions in this region, depending on in which status you are now and going forward. So again, thank you very much for attending the workshop this time. And we keep working closely together with ADB and ADBI going forward to help you adopt ISSB standards. So thank you very much for inviting us this time. So over to you, Agnes and Professor Shirai.
Thank you very much, Komori-san. Professor Shirai?
Yeah. So in the case of Bangladesh, their disclosure is focusing on banks and the financial institution. We also see a couple of countries like that. And in that case, central bank takes the lead because central bank, they usually monitor banking system. But having said that, after all, we really need, starting with a large company, they have to start to disclose because we need to change corporate industrial decarbonization efforts. So starting with bank is okay, but at the same time, I think we really need to focus on the corporate awareness. One more issue, I think, even though this disclosure is dealt with by stock exchange and financial regulators, I think all ministries are related. So you cannot just leave it to the financial regulator or stock exchange or central bank. For example, ISSB disclosure is related to carbon credit, which I mentioned yesterday. And also a company needs to disclose the impact of physical risk, right? A hazard and natural disaster. Then we have to know what the government is doing. I mean, are they introducing early warning signal, or are they introducing flood resilient, infrastructure? So all related. So I think all ministries have to work together. So not only one or two ministry. I think in the end, disclosure is important, but all other actions are necessary. Yeah, that's all.
Thank you very much, Professor Shirai. Personally, I would like also to thank all participants who joined the training workshop and all the speakers for their comprehensive presentations. Thanks to this online training, I have also a better understanding of the standard. And I want to thank you. So ADBI will continue to organize this kind of capacity building activity, and we look forward to seeing you again as part of our events. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And dear participants, please take 5 minutes to respond to our post-event survey, please. Thank you.